Let me tell you about something which I experienced a few months ago. I woke up wee hours of the morning from a dead sleep. Bev and I had just returned from India, and it is a brutal trip. And we traveled there with Dr. John Hall, and we went for a reason. It was a quick trip. It was for the dedication of a library at New Theological College. It was a project that we funded through our Imagine campaign when we had $1 million set aside for missions. Well, it took a few years for the school to gain the approval of the local Hindu-controlled city council in order to get a building permit. But they kept praying and persevering, and finally they won the day. They got the permit. And then, of course, it took time for construction. But at last, the library building was completed, and we were invited to go for the dedication ceremonies. Now, I'm not sure what I was expecting. I'd not been there. John Hall had been there. Others from our mission team back before we committed to the project, making certain that it was worthy. So I'm not certain what I was expecting, but I can tell you, upon arrival, I was blown away by the campus, the quality, but mostly by the students and the professors and their unbelievable commitment and sacrifice. Friends, it made me so proud that our church cares about sharing the good news. It made me so proud that the Woodlands United Methodist Church is all about missions, not just here at home, of which we are in a magnificent way, but also to the ends of the earth. And by the way, that library building, they did a good job. It was solidly constructed, and it'll be there for a long, long time. Now, as part of the ceremony, students, faculty, administrators all gathered on the lawn in front of the library and on the steps. And then the school president surprised John Hall and Bev and me when he undraped a large granite stone, larger than I can stand in terms of height. And on it, they had named this the Woodlands wing of the library. There we are. Never expected that. Well, all that was inspiring. But the trip itself was brutal. 23 plus hours of flying time from Dehradun, India to Houston. 23 plus hours. 11 and a half hours time change. Why they get that half in there, I don't know. It's India. It's India. Upon coming home, needless to say, our bodies were out of sync. Now, it was not that, nor was it thoughts of India which roused me from my slumber. One might reasonably suspect that I'd been dreaming about cows. After all, cows are everywhere in India, and they're considered sacred, so you find them in the cities, blocking traffic in busy intersections. They just go with it. Or wandering in and out of shops. If you think, oh, I'd like to just see what's in that shop, you may be walking in with a cow who must be thinking, I'd like to see what's in that shop too. Quite a strange experience for Westerners. One also might reasonably expect that my dream had been filled with monkeys, for they are ubiquitous and they have temples dedicated to them. But none of these exotic scenes were on my mind. No, they had not been on my mind nor in my dream. I awakened from the dead of sleep, bolted up with one inescapable thought: be a neighbor. I couldn't shake it from my mind. And I took it as a word from God, or maybe better stated, as an admonishment from the Lord. Because like so many other busy Americans, Bev and I have been lousy neighbors. It's shameful, really. For almost 20 years, we've lived in the same house, on the same street, in the same 8-house cul-de-sac. And yet we hardly know any of our neighbors by name. Oh, we say hello occasionally when we bump into each other at the cluster mailbox, and we always wave when their car passes by. But seldom do we engage in actual conversation. It's not that we are unfriendly, just busy, caught up in our own schedules, in our own responsibilities, caught up in our own lives. It's a shared guilt, I suppose, because I think that our experience is mirrored by so many others. Of course, it's not always been that way. You know this. Once upon a time, neighbors knew each other by name. They were connected with real relationships. One neighbor might borrow from another neighbor with hardly a thought, with a rap on the door. Sue might say, "Oh, hi, Sally, I'm so glad you're home. I was wondering if I could borrow a cup of sugar. I was baking a pie and I ran completely out." "Oh, why, sure, of course. Come on in. Don't you have time for a cup of coffee?" And so this small exchange would lead to a deeper conversation over coffee, which helped forge an authentic relationship. In days past, neighbors would get together for support and for community, and relationships were formed. But all that began to change with the development of modern conveniences, like the air conditioner, which meant that homes no longer needed to be constructed with large front porches, which were built to provide a place to escape the heat. And so people stopped sitting outside. Of course, the advance of technology also contributed to our communal isolation. Chief culprit certainly is the television. When it came on to our nation's scene in the early 50s, it was a game changer for most everyone. No longer did families have to create entertainment for themselves. Instead, now it was delivered to them, eventually in living color. And so instead of gathering to play cards with neighbors or friends, or dominoes, as was so often the case in Texas, people simply stayed home, behind closed doors, in the comfort of their own air-conditioned surroundings. Now, in more recent years, as has been often said, the internet and smartphones have accelerated this trend toward isolation. They provide substitute relationships. Even in our nuclear families, communication, this miracle of communication through internet and smartphones, it's drawn us apart from one another, even in our nuclear families. So kids can stay upstairs in their bedrooms, apart from others in the family, and be totally entertained and connected. And parents often sit at the same breakfast table or supper table, lost in their separate internet worlds. Even simple gadgets factor in, like garage door openers. Oh, they contribute to this problem of creeping isolation. We think of it. We pull up in our driveways. We punch the little button on our remote control. The door opens. We drive straight into the garage, and then we walk directly into our homes and shut the door, without even a chance of being outside to say hello to a neighbor. Americans are richer, more informed, and better connected than ever, and unhappier, more isolated, and less fulfilled. That's the observation of Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska. He writes in his new book, there is a growing consensus that loneliness, not obesity, cancer, or heart disease, but loneliness is the nation's #1 health crisis. Senator Sasse, Harvard educated, continues. He says, persistent loneliness reduces average longevity more than twice as much as heavy drinking. Back to my dream. When I woke up in the wee hours of the morning with those words from God, be a neighbor, burning in my mind, I wondered if this message might not be just for me, but for our culture, which seems to have forgotten the joy of living in community. Indeed, I wondered if that message might not be especially for the church. After all, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus said, it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. This concept of being a good neighbor, the importance of it is found throughout Scripture, both Old and New Testaments. And so this sermon series, starting today, is a call for Christian hospitality. It is a call for us to rediscover the joy of living in community and developing relationships with the people who make up our little piece of the world. Now, typically during Advent, we focus on what? On preparation. That's the operative word, preparation. Preparing our hearts for the coming of Jesus. And so in Advent, we often hear sermons on people from Scripture like Simeon, that old prophet who longed for the coming of the Messiah and went to the temple each day in prayer. Or we talk about Elizabeth, the cousin of Mary, the faithful older woman who gave birth to John the Baptizer. Or we talk about Mary, the young woman whose life changed overnight when she received the angel's terrifying news that she, Mary, would give birth to the promised one. We emphasize making room in our hearts for the newborn king, and all that is good, of course. But perhaps in our quest to make room within ourselves, we are overlooking a wider call to make room beyond ourselves, especially for those who are lonely or new to town and know hardly a soul, or those who don't have family close by and feel especially isolated during this Christmas time of year. Here's my point. If there were ever a time on the Christian calendar to reclaim the lost art of hospitality, Advent seems the perfect fit. Think about it. At the very beginning of Jesus' story, it carries with it the theme of welcoming, of making room. And it all started with the innkeeper. Let's remember what happened. Mary and Joseph were making their way to Bethlehem. It was a terrible set of circumstances. They found themselves caught up in a matter that was bigger than themselves. World events had swept them up. Some person named Caesar Augustus, had decreed that all the world should be taxed, each in his hometown. I suppose this is the most famous census ever conducted. And so Joseph and Mary had to travel to Bethlehem, far from their home in Nazareth. Can you imagine how frightened this young couple must have felt? How out of place they must have felt. Even though Bethlehem was the hometown of Joseph's ancestors, he had never lived there. For Mary and Joseph, Bethlehem was a strange place. And don't you know that they must have felt very much alone? A few thoughts come immediately to mind. First, thank goodness someone took them in. What time of day or night they arrived, we don't know. But we can be sure of this, we can be sure they were exhausted. After all, the journey would have not been simple under any circumstances. 2 travelers, a donkey. A long distance, no modern roads, no McDonald's or Chick-fil-A's along their way. And certainly no Holiday Inn or Motel 6 with a reservation waiting. Each night held its adventure and worry. Each night, camp had to be made. Each night, a fire needed to be built and lighted without the aid of matches. Surely there were robbers to worry about, thieves lurking in the distance, just waiting for a chance to move in and steal this young couple's meager possessions. Yes, by the time Joseph and Mary reached Bethlehem, they must have felt worn out. And oh, don't forget, Mary was pregnant. That's the all-important fact, isn't it? Mary was pregnant. Young, tired, vulnerable, scared, pregnant. And no reservation, no place to stay, no place to lay their heads. What a terrible situation. Never had they imagined what Bedlam awaited them in Bethlehem. We sing, O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Bethlehem was not still to them. No, it was a crowded place, jam-packed, filled with commotion and pilgrims. They'd never seen anything like it. Inn after inn had turned them down. Sorry, full. Good luck, young man. You'll need it. Joseph becomes increasingly urgent. Surely, sir, we've tried so many. Surely you can find us a room. We're expecting a baby any minute. Said the innkeeper. That's not my fault. Said Joseph. It's not my fault either. St. Luke tells us the events. Let's hear the story again in his own words. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, everyone to his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. We usually think of the innkeeper in negative terms, don't we? I do. No room in the inn. That phrase just sticks in our mind. We picture the innkeeper with a scowl on his face, coldly turning them away. And then we quickly imagine Joseph pleading with the innkeeper until the innkeeper finally gives in and sends them out back to stay with the animals. What a heartless, cold-blooded capitalist. That's the picture that comes to mind. What actually transpired at the reception desk that evening is not clear. St. Luke does not provide the details, and so we have to leave it to our imaginations. Perhaps, I submit, perhaps we should consider the innkeeper in a different light. Not as callous and insensitive, but welcoming and caring. A man who, in spite of the chaos of that day, with thousands of pilgrims crashing into town, a man still who took time to find a way to help this frightened young couple. You may be thinking, what are you talking about? He stuck them out back in a smelly barn. Yes. But that's the only place he had. And that was a warm place and a safe place. And the innkeeper knew that they were frightened and alone and that they needed help. So he made the effort. He took them in. He found a way to make room. Which leads me to a second thought. It's never good to feel lonely, is it? Now, sometimes we want to be alone for a period, maybe for some self-time, for recentering, getting our batteries recharged. So from time to time, we choose to be alone. But no one wants to be lonely. No one wants to feel left out. No one wants to be forgotten, especially not at Christmas. All of us need to know that someone cares for us. All of us need to feel wanted and included. We need someone who will invite us in. Here's what occurs to me. You and I can extend love and warmth to strangers in our own community, starting in our own neighborhood. Remember how I confessed a few moments ago about what lousy neighbors Bev and I have been? Well, we determined to change that. Honestly, I'm just going to say, God got my attention. When have I ever been awakened from a dead sleep and bolted up with a thought piercing in my mind, and that thought altogether random? Be a neighbor. What? Be a neighbor. Okay, Lord, I get it. So Bev and I have scheduled a neighborhood open house, a party. We've invited those folks who've lived around us for years, but whose names we mostly have not known, the ones that we just speak of by which car they drive. Oh, you know, it's the family down there that has that black Audi. Oh, okay. Or tell another story. Say, now, who are you talking about? The one that walked the little, that little terrier dog. Oh, I know them, yeah. We've invited those folks to the party. And what's more, we've decided it's not going to be a one-off, one time. Over the course of this next year, our intent is to host several dinner parties so we can get to know these neighbors and get to know them closely. Now, for several weeks, we asked if you all might share a neighbor story. And a number of you did. You sent in by email or by letter a neighbor story. Most of them were good neighbor experiences. A few were not so good. Like the family whose next door neighbors have a barking dog. a dog which barks. Did I say that? Barks day and night, incessantly. And even after so delicately, diplomatically mentioning it, they refuse to do anything about it. So it continues to bark. Or another story, one of our members who has a neighbor down the street a ways who drives ridiculously fast up and down that residential street filled with little children who like to play in the street. And then, just before Thanksgiving, that neighbor down the street had the gall to call the police and complain about little kids out in the street with chalk. Well, I think they ought to arrest them. Yes, there were a few horror stories which you sent in, but mostly you wrote about wonderful neighbors and how they've enriched your lives. Let me share one of these stories with you. A woman wrote in about a difficult time in her life. She was a young mother with 3 small children, one of them an infant, and she found herself in the throes of postpartum depression. To make matters worse, her marriage was on the rocks. But she was taught to pull herself up by her own bootstraps and to move on. And so she was making that gallant effort, but still filled with overwhelming sadness, she writes, and a sense of isolation because of a corporate move far from family. And when her husband would come home in the evenings after the commute and after dinner, she would go out for a walk, some time alone. And she said, I would pray to God for some solace and some relief from the depression. She said one December day, an elderly neighbor noticed her and stopped her just to say hi and to ask her some questions and find out about her, and showed interest. And then the next day, she wrote, he brought a poinsettia to the front porch. She writes, it was the most beautiful gift I ever received. And when I shut the door to my house that evening, I just cried. My neighbor didn't know what I was going through in my life, but he saw me, he noticed me, and he cared. She continues, I quote directly, someone cared. And that's all that mattered. Dear friends, let us never underestimate the power of simple acts of kindness. They not only show love, but they can also open the door to deeper relationships and real connection, and authentic friendship can develop from this. Now here's another thought I want to share with you. What if this year, this Christmas season, what if it weren't all about us? Me, my busy schedule, my shopping list, my parties I need to attend, my family, my friends. What if this year we decide to make room for others? What if we determine to make this season a time to reach out to those around us, those who may be lonely, those who may be far from home, those who simply need to know that someone cares? Do you know what I found interesting? Most of the stories we received over the email and in the regular mail, the stories that you shared, most that we received were not about some grand acts. No, but about little things, ways in which neighbors had shown kindness, gestures of friendship and caring. The neighbor who found out that I was sick and just showed up and mowed the yard. The neighbor who knocked on my door with a loaf of home-baked bread and said, I thought you might could use this possibly. An elderly member who wrote about her neighbor who picks up her newspaper off the driveway every day and puts it on her front porch. Simple acts of kindness. And so I want to challenge you, all of us, me included, no, me most of all, to find ways this Christmas season to be a good neighbor. Friends, I cannot think of a better time to open our doors to those around us than Christmas, to invite some family in our midst home to share a meal, or perhaps simply to host some neighborhood cookie party at your house. Might there be some way that we can all find to open our homes and our hearts to those around us? It does seem, after all, that following Jesus should require more than singing carols and lighting candles. We should discover the joy of loving others in tangible ways. One more thought. The idea of making room does not just apply in our personal homes, does it? But how about our church house as well? What would it mean to guests who walk through these doors, the doors of this church house, if we were intentional about inviting them in and making them feel welcomed? Not just making room for them in the pews, squeezing in a bit, or actually letting them unknowingly sit in our spot. But if we were to invite them to Lessons and Carols, one of my 3 favorite services of the year, Easter, Christmas Eve, Lessons and Carols. Or how about to this, it's not a musical, it's an extravaganza next weekend, presented by our choir and orchestra, and we could invite them in. Shouldn't we be especially mindful of guests who make their way to our church home during this Christmas season and make certain that they feel welcomed? A quick story. Sam Rayburn was Speaker of the House. He died in 1961. Historians agree that he was the most powerful speaker ever to hold the position, and he held it for the longest. He was known affectionately as Mr. Sam. When he learned that he had terminal cancer, he shocked everyone by announcing that he was going back home to his small town, Bonham, Texas. And everyone said to him, Mr. Sam or Mr. Speaker, oh, don't do that. I mean, surely you know we have some of the finest medical institutions in all the land, right here in our capital, Washington, D.C. Why go back to the little town now? Sam Rayburn's answer has often been quoted. He said the following: because in Bonham, Texas, they know if you're sick, and they care when you die. We all need community, don't we? A place to belong, to know that we matter, and know that people care. And so when people walk through the doors into this church, into this sanctuary, during this Christmas season, let us by all means make certain that they feel welcomed. There's an old saying that came to my mind, that the church is not designed to be a country club for saints, but a hospital for sinners. And aren't we glad? But here's the thought that comes to my mind. If the church is going to be a hospital, then it first must be hospitable. We're going to have a lot of guests among us, some lonely, some sad, some hesitant in their coming, some carrying burdens which we can hardly imagine, some searching for a word of hope. By all means, let's make room for them. Let's make sure they feel welcomed and wanted, and that they sense that this is a place where God's love abounds. Well, let's speak to newcomers. Let's greet them with a smile. Let's be quick to introduce ourselves. Let's make room for them. After all, that's what God has done for us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.